You are listening to 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Vallone. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, castle doctrine and stand your ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Well. Just when you thought the 2020 elections couldn't get any more contentious, Ruth Bader Ginsburg goes and dies. The nerve of some people. It seems that try though she might, Justice Ginsburg just couldn't quite make it through the election. And of course, in a grand temper tantrum, Senator Chuck Schumer announced that if Republicans do what they are perfectly within their rights to do and appoint Ginsburg's replacement, he will consider, and I quote, everything on the table. Ooh, be afraid. Be very afraid. We will discuss this at length later in the show, but for now I want you to remember this phrase, for it is the answer to how Republicans should respond to the Democrat temper tantrum. It is WWDD. More on that later. We will also hear a Soviet defector describe how communists take over a society from within. And although the interview dates from 1984, the tactics he describes will sound chillingly like what we are experiencing today. And we will hear about the many ways the left is stacking the deck against you in the election, not just nationwide, but right here in North Carolina. But first, this just in gun rights news. Some good news. In the period from March to July, across the battleground stakes, FBI background checks for gun sales are up by 93% from the previous year, as thousands of new gun buyers realize the police can't or aren't allowed to protect them. In North Carolina, they are up by 114.5%. The reason that's important is that speculation is being made by political experts that new gun buyers might signify new voters against the gun ban platform of the, and I put this in quotes, Harris-Biden ticket, and Democrats in general. Let's hope. That might be the one upside of the inability of new gun buyers to get pistol purchase permits in Wake County and in some other North Carolina counties. They are now experiencing what restrictive gun laws really looked like. The Breonna Taylor riots reached into North Carolina this week as riots broke out in Asheville and Durham. You may recall that a Kentucky grand jury declined to indict for murder 3 Louisville police officers who broke into Taylor's apartment and, after being fired on by Taylor's boyfriend, returned fire, killing her. Incidentally, although the police entry was initially portrayed as a no-knock entry without police identifying themselves, the facts in the case have proven that false. Police did identify themselves prior to breaking down Taylor's door. In response to the decision, as if they needed any reason at all, riots broke out in cities across the country. In Durham, fires were set, windows were broken, and more than a dozen businesses were damaged in Durham, including some at the American Tobacco campus. In our other bastion of leftism, Asheville, Chad Nesbitt, a local Republican activist and Facebook blogger, sustained traumatic brain injury when attacked by what the Asheville Citizen-Times blithely described as protesters outside Pax Tavern. Incidentally, this was one day after the leftists of the Asheville City Council voted 5-2 Tuesday night to cut police department funding for the city by $700,000. Defund police, baby. Council member Brian Hayes opposed the measure because he said the cuts didn't go far enough. You just can't make this stuff up. Elsewhere, please let me announce that in the critical 2020 elections, Grassroots North Carolina now has candidate information available for all candidates registered across North Carolina. Specifically, we include two types of candidate information with respect to which candidates support the right to keep and bear arms. First, GRNC candidate evaluations provide objective data on candidates' history on gun rights, including voting records, bill sponsorship, survey scores, and more. And although that might sound time-consuming and cumbersome to review, we condense it into a single value by comparing the candidate with a control group of conservative gun owners. A candidate who agrees with the control group at least 90% of the time gets 4 stars, 80% 3 stars, 70% 2 stars, on down the list. Second, our Political Action Committee, the GRNC Political Victory Fund, provides candidate recommendations for each race in which the candidate we estimate will best support your rights. Finally, we provide recommendations on judicial candidates in statewide races as well. Many gun rights supporters don't vote in judicial races because they feel they aren't important to gun rights. But nothing could be further from the truth. Electing originalist judges that will interpret the law as the framers intended rather than trying to legislate from the bench is crucial to preserving the right to keep and bear arms. We will discuss some specific races later, but right now I want you to remember this: grnc.org. Again, grnc.org. That is where you can find all of the candidate data on our homepage, grnc.org. Well, surprise, surprise, calls to defund the police aren't just a feature of leftist governments in places like Portland anymore. Now they are coming from Democrat candidates right here in North Carolina. It seems that last week, North Carolina House Speaker Tim Moore held a most interesting press conference in which he discussed a left-wing policy organization called America's Goals, which dangled money in front of Democrat candidates willing to sign its pledge. And a most interesting pledge it is, advocating as it does the agenda of the hard left. Candidates of the ilk of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, and other socialists, including a pledge to defund police. And in dangling the hook to pledge defunding of police, this left-wing organization caught dozens, yes, dozens of North Carolina Democrats. To give you an idea of the value of leadership, House Democrats almost uniformly signed the pledge to defund police, but Senate Democrats did not. And Moore wasn't just speaking for himself and doing political grandstanding. Members of law enforcement who stood with him and against the defund Democrats included, Harnett County Sheriff Wayne Coates, Craven County Sheriff Chip Hughes, Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page, former Wake County Sheriff Donnie Harrison, former Pender County Sheriff and now Representative Carson Smith, former High Point Police Chief and now Representative John Faircloth, and others. Speaker Moore said, and I quote, "Right now, law enforcement officers across the nation are being targeted and attacked. I consider signing this pledge a direct attack on North Carolina's law enforcement too." Speaker Moore noted that House Republican members and candidates include several current and former law enforcement officers, and that House Republicans have increased salaries and funding for public safety departments in the General Assembly. In our next segment, we will tell you exactly which North Carolina House Democrats signed the pledge to defund your safety. But first, let me put in a little plug for our Political Action Committee, the GRNC Political Victory Fund. GRNC PVF does independent expenditures into races across the state to promote candidates who will support your right to keep and bear arms. We do independent expenditures because, quite frankly, we don't like throwing money at candidates. We can't use membership money to influence elections by law, and so we're forced to raise money for GRNC PVF separately. We would love it if you could go to grnc.org/PVF, like Political Victory Fund, and help us out. grnc.org/PVF. Right now you're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a break, we will return with how Democrats are trying to steal the election right here in North Carolina. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In our last segment, we described the press conference at which Republican North Carolina House Speaker Tim Moore outed North Carolina House Democrats who, in return for campaign funding, signed a pledge to defund police. And who exactly are the leftists who would defund your safety? Well, they include Sidney Batch from Wake, Christy Clark from Mecklenburg, Terrence Everett, Wake, Wesley Harris from Mecklenburg, Rachel Hunt from Mecklenburg, Democrat leader Darren Jackson from Wake, Representative Brandon Lofton from Mecklenburg, Joe Sam Queen from Haywood, Ray Russell from Ashe, and Candy Smith from Pitt, among dozens of others. Of particular interest are those in tight races. Christy Clark, for example, won the seat previously held by Republican John Bradford, despite the district being rated R+5 by the Civitas Partisan Index. Better yet, Clark was an activist for Bloomberg's AstroTurf gun ban organization, Moms Demand Action, and has introduced several gun control bills in the General Assembly. Democrat Joe Sam Queen hails from Western North Carolina in a district with a Civitas R+2 rating and has voted wrong on nearly every gun issue, despite living in a rural district where just about everybody owns guns. Ray Russell is a former university professor, with all the political leanings that might imply, in an R+3 district. Then we have Brandon Lofton, who's running against pro-gun Republican Don Pomeroy in Mecklenburg, Nicole Quick, who's running against pro-gun Republican John Hardister, and Democrat Francis Jackson, who's running against pro-gun Republican John Zoka in Fayetteville. All of those Democrats signed a pledge to defund police. Very interesting. Well, speaking of election fixing, we weren't? Well, we should be. Democrat ballot fixing is coming soon to a state near you, namely yours. At issue, of course, are absentee ballots either mailed unsolicited to mass numbers of people or otherwise flooding state election systems with ballots of questionable validity. The tactic is being used by Democrats who expect Trump to win by a narrow margin. By encouraging unsolicited ballots and millions of mail-in votes, flooding the mail and sparking millions of questionable ballots, their goal, quite simply, is to undermine the legitimacy of the elections, with the hope of getting Obama judges and Democrat-led boards of election to overturn a Trump victory. But you thought all of that was in states like Nevada, right? Wrong. Thanks to Democrat-led state board of elections right here, we are now fighting that battle in North Carolina. Yes, sirree, the Board of Elections is now going to help voters fill out absentee ballots, saying that 43% were of incorrectly completed and therefore uncounted absentee ballots are from blacks, despite the fact that blacks only account for 16% of absentee ballots submitted. Apparently, ballots are racist. Under the scheme, which has yet to be approved by a judge as part of a settlement of a lawsuit brought by Democrat activists, the Board of Elections would contact people who failed to fill out the ballots correctly and have them submit an affidavit to supplement the ballot. North Carolina House Speaker Tim Moore said the changes would, quote, gut the integrity of North Carolina voting laws, and said he is looking into legal options to stop the practice. Oh, yes. They would now have 9 not 3, 9 days after the election day to perpetuate this fraud instead of the current 3 days currently in law, Although theoretically absentee ballots would still have to be postmarked by election day, I think it's safe to say that too would be ignored. Incidentally, although the Raleigh News and Observer called the decision by the 5-member board, comprising 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats, as unanimous, WRAL reports that following the decision, the 2 Republicans resigned from the board. Republican candidate for governor Dan Forrest has asked Attorney General Bill Barr to investigate. To give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem, nearly 1 million absentee ballots have thus far been requested in North Carolina alone. Onto that, add the following. According to the Civitas Institute, in August, our State Board of Elections, specifically its Executive Director, Karen Brinson Bell, decided to accept absentee ballots transmitted illegally. And in the same memo, decided that to eliminate signature matching for absentee ballots. And still speaking of election fraud, Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican of Florida, recently told Fox News' Sean Hannity that a criminal probe may be underway against billionaire and anti-gun zealot Michael Bloomberg, the financier behind AstroTurf gun ban organizations like Moms Demand Action. It seems that Bloomberg decided it would be a good idea to pay the fines of 32,000 Florida felons so they could vote. Yes, in Florida, felons may vote. Specifically, Florida passed a law in 2018 reinstating voting rights for felons that dictated they could register only if they pay all fines, fees, and restitution, sometimes totaling more than $1,000 owed to the government. House Judiciary member Matt Gaetz told Hannity Tuesday that he has spoken with Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody about potentially launching a bribery investigation into Bloomberg. Said Fox News, quote, "Under Florida law, it's a third-degree felony for someone to either directly or indirectly provide something of value to impact whether or not someone votes. So the question is whether or not paying off someone's fines and legal obligations counts as something of value, and clearly it does." And finally, according to Fox News, the Justice Department sent a letter to a Pennsylvania county on Thursday ordering it to change its practices after multiple military ballots were found discarded. The issue surfaced earlier in the day when the DOJ announced that it had recovered a small number of discarded ballots. While the Justice Department would not say where they had found the ballots, they did say that there were 9 recovered, 7 of which were cast for President Trump, while the other 2 were sealed by Luzerne County before the FBI recovered them. So let's add it all up, shall we? 9 Democrat states and the District of Columbia have so far adopted universal mail-in balloting, which differs from absentee ballots by virtue of the fact that the states mail absentee ballots to all registered voters, meaning hundreds of thousands of ballots end up going to the wrong place as people fail to update addresses or addresses are otherwise undeliverable, with the attendant implications on opportunities for voter fraud. Felons are now allowed to vote after meeting varying requirements in literally dozens of states, including, most recently, the battleground state of Florida. Democrat lawsuits are underway in a variety of states in order to loosen requirements for absentee ballots, such as eliminating or weakening witness requirements, such as we have done here. Democrat lawsuits have forced redistricting in several states, including Virginia and right here in North Carolina. Under this scheme, activist Obama judges invalidate the will of voters by overturning districts drawn by legislators and calling them racist. This, by the way, is what helped turn Virginia blue in the 2019 elections. Oh yes, I forgot to mention that the Washington Free Beacon said the following, and I quote, "The Public Interest Legal Foundation, an Indiana-based election integrity group, conducted a nationwide study to identify the hundreds of thousands of deceased individuals on voter rolls. Specifically, that would be the 350,000 dead voters on voter rolls across 42 states. Yep, universal mail-in balloting, what's the worst that could happen? Said the Free Beacon, and I quote, just 5 states, New York, Texas, Michigan, Florida, and California, accounted for 51% of the total number of deceased individuals on voter rolls, according to the group. PILF further found that nearly 15,000 registrants were credited with voting after death in the 2016 and 2018 elections. And let's not forget the 40,000 likely duplicate registrants who, and I quote, appear to have cast second votes in 2018 from the same address. Nope, no voter fraud here, say the Democrats. Absolutely no need for voter ID laws that they fight tooth and nail, including lawsuits, to prevent. Move along, folks. Nothing to see here. I bet you're sensing a pattern here. Forward observer analyst Sam Culper calls it preparing the battlefield. I call it voter fraud, but whatever you call it, Democrats have clearly declared war on our election process. By the way, notice that in an exercise of projection, Democrats invariably accuse Republicans, and Donald Trump in particular, of doing exactly what they themselves are doing. The only way for us to win is to win decisively, not by narrow margins, and right now, Real Clear Politics puts North Carolina at 46.7% for Biden and 45.9% for Trump. Decisive victory depends on you. To win overwhelmingly, you must not only go to the polls, but also check your voter registration, use your absentee ballot early and carefully if you choose to use one, use GRNC Political Victory Fund candidate recommendations, and bring like-minded voters to the polls. After a short break, we will return with information on the tactics being used by socialists to take over our society in their own words and the battle over the Supreme Court. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. As I have discussed in previous episodes of the show, the upheaval we have experienced over the past few months is not random. Said Tucker Carlson just this week, and I quote, "It's hard to think clearly when things are on fire. That's a basic rule of life. That may be why, looking back on it, we've seen so much arson recently. If you wanted to keep the public from thinking clearly about what you plan to do to their country, you might riot and no one would notice that you're lying." They definitely have been lying. Every story we've been told from the past 3 months has been at its core a lie, all of them from the first day. And into that lie he included George Floyd, who actually had lethal levels of fentanyl in his system, and Breonna Taylor, who, as it turns out, was not subjected to a no-knock entry. In truth, police identified themselves before entering. As I noted in previous episodes of the show, an expert on the shadowy and ever-changing socialist organizations, Trevor Loudon, who writes for the Epoch Times, has documented how Black Lives Matter is actually a front group for a socialist organization called Liberation Road, which is itself a splinter group from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which itself traces its roots to the Weather Underground, the terrorist group responsible for something like 25 bombings in the U.S. in the 1970s. You probably don't know that just a couple of weeks ago, Bill Ayers of the Weather Underground addressed leftist agitators right here in Asheville. In previous episodes, I've also referenced the video in which 2 of the 3 Black Lives Matter founders, Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza, brag about being, quote, trained Marxists, end quote. And to bring it home, Trevor Loudon recently said, quote, "The rioters who attacked police officers with Molotov cocktails and fireworks and torched numerous buildings in Kenosha, Wisconsin for about a week included members of the same pro-China communist group that sparked the May riots in Minneapolis after the police-involved killing of George Floyd. Maoist activists from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, FRSO, can take most, if not all, of the credit for inciting the recent rioting in Kenosha. Loudon went on to deal how the FRSO banners can be seen in videos at the forefront of the Kenosha riots. So now I would like to play an interview I came across in which KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov describes the tactic of ideological subversion as it's applied to America. It's a 1984 interview, but remarkably timely. Judge for yourself if any of it sounds familiar. What Bezmenov describes is the Marxist plan for what they called ideological subversion, a term foreign to most Americans, which describes the incremental process of changing our perception of reality regarding our right to defend ourselves, our community, our family, and our society. He lays out the plan in 4 phases. Here it is.
Mr. Bezmenov was born in 1939 in a suburb of Moscow. He was the son of a high-ranking Soviet Army officer. He was educated in the elite schools inside the Soviet Union and became an expert in Indian culture and Indian languages. He had an outstanding career with Novosti, which was the, and still is, I should say, the press arm or the press agency of the Soviet Union. It turns out that this is also a front for the KGB. He escaped to the West in 1970 after becoming totally disgusted with the Soviet system, and he did this at great risk to his life. He certainly is one of the world's outstanding experts on the subject of Soviet propaganda and disinformation and active measures. Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate 1 generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. Your leftists in United States, all these professors and all these beautiful civil rights defenders, they are instrumental in the process of the subversion only to destabilize the nation. When their job is completed, they are not needed anymore. They know too much. Some of them, when they get disillusioned, when they see that Marxist-Leninists come to power, obviously they get offended. They think that they will come to power. That will never happen, of course. They will be lined up against the wall and shot. But they may turn into the most bitter enemies of Marxist-Leninists when they come to power. And that's what happened in Nicaragua. You remember most of these former Marxist-Leninists were either put to prison or one of them split, and now he's working against Sandinistas. It happened in Grenada when Maurice Bishop was already a Marxist. He was executed by a new Marxist who was more Marxist than this Marxist. Same happened in Afghanistan when first there was Taraki, he was killed by Amin, then Amin was killed by Babrak Karmal with the help of KGB. Same happened in Bangladesh when Mujibur Rahman, very pro-Soviet leftist, was assassinated by his own Marxist-Leninist military comrades. It's the same pattern everywhere. The time bomb is ticking.
You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return with our pièce de résistance, the battle for the Supreme Court and what it means to the future of our republic. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. For the past week, Democrats have elevated their feigned outrage to previously unseen levels as they uniformly denounced the pending appointment by President Donald Trump of a Supreme Court justice to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ginsburg, you see, was a member of the progressive, and I use that word in quotes, arm of the Supreme Court, one of the 4 of 9 who voted against the affirmation of the individual right to keep and bear arms in the landmarked cases of D.C. versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago. Cases which began the process of charting recognition of your right to keep and bear arms. And perhaps more relevant to the current debate, he was one of 4 of 9 who would have made Al Gore president in the year 2000. By the time you read this, Trump will likely have made his official announcement of his nominee, who by unofficial accounts is Amy Coney Barrett. I'll talk about her later. Democrats, of course, claim that Republicans set a precedent by refusing to confirm Barack Obama's pick namely anti-gun judge Merrick Garland, to the vacancy created by the death of Antonin Scalia back when Republicans controlled the Senate during the end of the Obama administration. It's the end of Trump's term, they whine, and just as Republicans refused to confirm Garland at the end of Obama's term, they should now refuse to confirm Trump's nominee. Republicans, of course, respond that it isn't the same situation since Obama was leaving office and Republicans, being of the opposition party, were under no obligation to confirm a Democrat nominee. Lacking the power to stop Republicans, Democrats have now resorted to invective and threats. They're trying to frame the race as about abortion in an effort to divide female voters from Trump, but of course the nomination is about far more than that. Senate Minority Leader, who wants to be Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, perhaps the most anti-gun member of the Senate, has been particularly flowery in his high state of dudgeon. By holding the nomination hearings, Schumer says Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is defiling the Senate. I want you to think of all the definitions of the word defile, and then picture Mitch McConnell doing that to the Senate. Anyway, but Schumer's threats are what has gotten the most attention. If Republicans go forward with the nomination, says Schumer, everything is on the table, his words. Translated, he is threatening that if Democrats gain control of the Senate, they will end the filibuster, giving them more power to push their leftist agenda, make states of Puerto Rico and D.C., the latter is unconstitutional, incidentally, which would ensure a permanent Democrat majority in Congress. They would make good on Franklin Roosevelt's threat to pack the Supreme Court by expanding its number to include the leftists they appoint, and perhaps they will even end the Electoral College, meaning that populous states, such as, California, would now run your life. But there's a little problem with these threats that the more timid conservatives among us should remember. Schumer threatens Armageddon. Well, Armageddon my ass. If Democrats gain power, they're going to do all of this anyway. They've been threatening it for months, if not years. It's abundantly clear that a death grip on power is exactly what leftists are looking for. Consequently, you must ignore Schumer's threats. Let's consider the intellectual dishonesty of the Democrat argument, namely precedent versus rules. Even if you accept the Democrat argument, which I do not, that Republicans are hypocrites by reversing their position between Garland and the present situation, and by the way, nobody seems to point out that both parties have changed positions on the appointment of Supreme Court justices at the end of a presidential term. Democrats in 2016 argued to appoint. Now they argue against. Regardless, nothing about what the Republicans did in 2016 has any binding precedent on the Senate. By contrast, Democrats made their own bed when, in 2013, Democrat Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, frustrated that he didn't have the needed supermajority of 60 votes that the Senate requires for a vote of cloture, which is a vote to end debate and actually vote, frustrated by his inability to shove through leftist judicial appointments to federal courts, Reid didn't change the precedent, he changed the rules. Remember the nuclear option? Reid changed the rules regarding judicial appointments, those short of the Supreme Court, such that a simple majority of 50 votes rather than a supermajority of 60 votes was all that was needed to confirm judges. Mitch McConnell followed suit in making exactly the same change to the rules for Supreme Court appointments. So the Democrat change to the rules for judicial confirmations came back and bit them in the ass. Had they not made that change in 2013, they likely wouldn't be in the situation they now face. But all of this is window dressing that you should ignore. The naked reality is that politics is the adjudication of power. Who rules whom? In some countries, the adjudication of power results from killing your opponents. Here, happily, we settle it in elections, at least for now. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself said in a video now being widely circulated, the president is the president for 4 years, not 3. The only relevant facts that you should consider are that the president has the constitutionally delegated power to nominate Supreme Court justices, and the Senate has the power to decide whether or not to confirm them. Period. Nothing else matters. The only reasonable argument is the one made by Ted Cruz, who is brilliant, by the way, I've met him, namely that we must have a full complement of 9 justices when, and I do mean when, the Supreme Court is forced to deal with the election irregularities of the 2020 elections and make that final adjudication of power, namely, who wins the presidential election. What Cruz doesn't say, probably in the interest of political comity, is that having 5 true originalists on the high court terrifies leftists, because creating election irregularities and dragging out hundreds of lawyers to litigate Biden into office has been the strategy of the Democrats for the 2020 elections all along. In the court before Ginsburg's death, it was 4-4, with Chief Justice Roberts, the not-so-conservative appointed by George W. Bush, a wild card. But a wild card likely to take the position that the Supreme Court shouldn't be political and shouldn't get involved. So before Ginsburg's death, the Democrat strategy to negate a Trump victory in the court would likely have succeeded. In effect, Democrats were looking for a do-over of Bush v. Gore in 2000, but with a better landscape in the Supreme Court. Moreover, with Ginsburg gone, an 8-justice Supreme Court works out even better for their strategy, because even in the event Roberts votes against their attempted coup d'etat, and that is what it is, by the way, a coup d'etat, even if Roberts votes against them, the Supreme Court is tied 4-4, leaving in place the decision of a lower circuit like, say the infamous Ninth Circuit. But if Trump holds to his pattern and successfully nominates a true constitutionalist to the Supreme Court, it throws a serious wrench into the mechanics of the Democrat scheme. Now, for what it's worth, the leading judicial contender, Amy Coney Barrett, by her previous writings, seems very favorably disposed to upholding the Second Amendment. So, you are lamenting the utter lack of civility in our political process? Civility that used to rule our society but is now utterly lacking? Maybe you're lamenting that ramming a Supreme Court appointment down Democrats' throats is not the polite thing to do. Me too. I long for the days of civil discourse rather than the current practice of beatings and arson. At the first opportunity, I plan to return to those days. But if the left wins the election and with it control of our society, rest assured we will never again see those days. We can't afford to play touch football while the left plays tackle. You've probably heard the phrase WWJD, what would Jesus do? When you hear people complain about the unfairness of Republicans replacing Ginsburg, I want you to say WWDD. Namely, if the roles were reversed, what would Democrats do? My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your right to keep and bear arms. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at HyattGuns.com. I also encourage you to check out my website at GunsPoliticsAndFreedom.com, spell out the and, GunsPoliticsAndFreedom.com, where you can find both my writings and earlier editions of the show. See you next week.